much. I would also like to thank Thomas Silberhorn for his very kind words, and also all of you for being here. It's been very long journeys in many cases, lost luggage and hassles of the journey in many cases, and I am very much looking forward to our time together. So in this half hour, what we will do very briefly is just, as a network needs to do, figure out, in a sense, what we have been doing. Each of us know a little part from wherever we are, and perhaps in this next half hour we will see what some other parts of the network have been doing. So I begin simply by welcoming the different participants. As has already been said, we have participants from over 20 countries, from 10 agencies, and over 80 participants gathered here. And so I'm sure there will be a time of rich interchange, and really that is the primary purpose of the network. And so the agenda is set up to reflect it. Let me tell you a little bit about the heart of the agenda. You have seen the time scale. The Parliamentary Secretary of State quoted Amartya Sen and the importance of each human being and of their capability to lead a decent life. And really it is fundamentally for each of us that humane motivation, perhaps, that is our true agenda, finding out how we can be more effective in advancing the well-being of those who face very distressing hardships. So I begin with a quote by Jean Drèze and Amartya Sen's 2013 book on India, where they observe that positive changes have often occurred and yielded some liberation when the remedying of ailments has been sought actively and pursued with vigor. And I believe that what we will see this morning are already a lot of examples of different people pursuing actively and with vigor the improvement of the conditions of the poorest of the poor. And so that is our fundamental agenda, learning how to do that better. In terms of the practicalities, we begin with, instead of having introductions of names and countries, we have introductions from a dozen different countries of their activities in very brief 7-minute cameos each. And this is a chance for us really to absorb some of the diversity of experience which is here in the room. And we will continue to absorb it in the keynotes and the presentations tomorrow. We follow that in the afternoon by first a roundtable where we will talk about the purpose we have as a network and some concrete points of action. In your packages is a very draft communiqué which has 3 purposes, and we'll have an idea of whether these are still relevant or how they could be improved. And in particular, we will also talk about very concrete steps for post-2015 in that session. We will then, that is a session of interchange, but then we have much more flexibility in the working groups, where we have 2 rooms, parallel session, and chances really to exchange and ask questions and learn from experiences in a much more targeted and focused way. One with Gonzalo Hernandez Licona from Mexico, who has been a leader in this network from the very beginning, will be on institutionalization of the network and policy communication. And the other with Xiaolin Wang from China and James Foster will be on emerging research issues, on communication, and on just measurement design. How do you choose dimensions and indicators? And then the flexibility increases quite dramatically because we have a whole boat to talk to and no agenda for the evening. And in the morning of day 2, we have more depth, because this morning we will listen, but we don't have a chance for questions, answers, or more of the texture and the detail of implementation. So in addition to the keynotes, and I should have mentioned that we have also a keynote from the Vice President of the Dominican Republic this morning, which gives us the first insight in greater depth. And then we continue with keynotes tomorrow from Juan Manuel Valle de Mexico, and the Vice President of Costa Rica and the Prime Minister of St. Lucia. And we'll also then have more in-depth presentations by some participants of their different angles of their ongoing work. And then tomorrow afternoon, in a sense, we start to come towards action. We talk about the internal structure of the network and its governance. Those things are very important to get right. There's a draft document, and the country participants will try to finalize that, as well as some next steps for action. And other agencies then will also talk about the points of intersection for joint action and collaboration. And we will close, in a sense, by not only saying what the network will do, but anyone who wishes to, speaking what they will do in the coming year. So that's our agenda for the next 2 days. And then I will do 2 other things. The first is to give a very brief overview, which for many of you will be a complete review of multidimensional poverty measurement, because we all come at different phases. And in a sense, for some it might not be such a review. And this last thing will simply be to inform you about what the MPPN has been doing over the past year. So already in his remarks, Thomas Silberhorn recognized the importance of going beyond income poverty into a multidimensional space. This has been championed by Amartya Sen, but it's been also championed in Ubuntu, in many, many local and national and ethical movements in different places. And so going beyond income to look at the different deprivations that batter a person's life brings us to a multidimensional measure, which, as James Foster put it in his Desiderata initially, has to be intuitive, something that can be communicated not only within academia, but to users and to the wider public, that somehow reflects their understanding of what poverty is. But then it has to be able to be broken down enough to guide policy, to monitor, and to give some kind of technical support and rigor to evidence-based policy making. So these are some of the reasons that multidimensional poverty measurement has come of interest at the present time. It is perhaps that the demand for measures that go beyond income poverty has also found different vehicles that are able to carry this forward. So let me just show you very briefly an example. This example is taken from one particular institutionalization or implementation of one particular measure of the class of measures. And it is the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index, which was launched in 2010 and is published by UNDP's Human Development Report Office and estimated at OFI. And Adriana Conconi led the estimations in 2014. Anna Vaj, also among us, was key to looking at changes over time. So in this measure, the first thing to do is to develop a deprivation profile for each person. So there are a set of dimensions which organize the different indicators. And then there are, in the case of the global MPI, 10 indicators: nutrition, child mortality, years of schooling of adults, if a child is attending school for children, cooking fuel, electricity, water, sanitation, assets, and electricity in the living standard indicators. And according to those indicators, each person is identified as deprived or non-deprived in each of those 10 indicators. So what a deprivation profile looks like is some set of indicators that a particular person experiences those deprivations at the same time. So for each person in the society, including non-poor people, you make a profile of any deprivations that they experience. And then, because one deprivation may not indicate poverty, one deprivation may not be serious enough, it may identify over 90% of the population as being poor, or it may be constrained by data accuracy, we often, very good, look at identify people as poor if they are deprived simultaneously in a number of different indicators. And this accords with poor people's own descriptions of how poverty is more a rainstorm of deprivations at the same time. So in this case, in the case of the global MPI, a person is poor if they are deprived in 1/3 of the weighted indicators at the same time. As you will see this morning, other countries have other indicators, other cutoffs, and other definitions of poverty, but the structure is the same. For each person, you create a profile, and then you identify whether or not they are poor by some national or otherwise poverty line. And an MPI, a multidimensional poverty index, is very simple. It's the percentage of people who are poor because they're deprived, for example, in 1/3 or more of the indicators. So it could be 40% of the population. And you multiply that times intensity, which is the percentage of deprivations that people experience at the same time. The average poor person experiences at the same time. Maybe I experience 39 deprivations and you experience 5% of deprivations and other people 60% of deprivations. So the intensity is the average deprivations among the poor, and it gives an idea of, in a sense, the breadth of poverty that most people experience. That methodology was developed with James Foster, who's the author also of the Foster, Greer, and Thorbecke Index, the most widely implemented index in income poverty in the world. And it's a straightforward extension of one of the elements of that class, and so shares many of the axiomatic properties, which I will not go into. So that, in 3 minutes, is a very brief overview of the methodology. And then how is it applied? The global MPI, which I shared with you, is a particular application which can be compared across countries because the indicators, the deprivations, the weights, and the poverty cutoff are very similar across countries, nearly the same, as identical as the data permit. And so it enables us to make comparisons this year across 108 countries. It enables us to compare the percentage of people who are multidimensionally poor by this definition of acute poverty with the percentage of people who are poor by the $1.25 a day measure, and see how they are similar and how they differ. This is one particular useful method in that you can learn lessons across different countries, but it's very limited for national use because an international measure will not reflect the culture, will not reflect the policy priorities, the statistical data sets perhaps, and so it is not appropriate in most cases for national measurement. But before I move on to the national measures, I'll just give you a very brief oversight of some of the materials that we launched a few weeks ago in OFI on the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index 2014, where there are life studies, including one of Natalie by Buba Husseini, our newest postdoc in the team in northeastern Cameroon, and other stories from other countries. We also summarize the key policy messages in briefings for policy leaders. There are infographics for teenagers and for others who want a very simple and intuitive way to get at a measure. There's an interactive data bank where you can look at a particular country, its disaggregation, its map, and choose indicators that are of interest to you. And there are data tables that can be downloaded for 108 countries, for changes over time for 34 countries, for inequality among the poor, a new measure of destitution, decomposition for 780 subnational regions. So those are the kind of crude comparisons that can be done with an international measure. But as I mentioned, that is often not good enough for national use. So the second application, which really is most of the work and most of the time of the network and is of fundamental importance, are the real measures that are used for policy, which are context-specific. They may be national, they may be subnational, they may be oriented to a particular project or policy intervention. And the presentations that you will hear this morning are national multidimensional poverty measures. These are vital for policy. As you will know, no government in the world uses the $1.25 a day poverty measure for national purposes. They use their own national poverty measures, their national poverty lines. Similarly, in multidimensional space, we need nationally tailored multidimensional poverty measures. And so there are these two different kinds of measures, and they are complements, not competitors. So in a sense, we perhaps need to speak about both of them because they both serve different purposes. So for an example, there's been discussion, and we'll mention it a little bit, about post-2015 and improved MPI for the post-2015 context. This might be an internationally comparable measure or more than one. And yet at the same time, as we already know, many countries are developing national poverty measures. And that is where the real work is being done in terms of advancing policies and learning about how to manage what you measure. And we certainly have learned a great deal from colleagues in Mexico, in Colombia, in Philippines, who are already implementing this work. So learning from these colleagues, we have learned, in a sense, the uses of national multidimensional poverty measures, which tend to be to track poverty over time, perhaps as an official statistic, to compare poverty across regions or ethnic groups or indigenous groups, to monitor changes in each indicator, and to coordinate different policy actors around a shared agenda. It can be also used to target geographically or at the household level, and to evaluate policy impacts. So just to give you an example, these are very familiar slides, so I'll go quickly through them. In Nepal, there was a tremendous reduction in poverty in a 5-year period, where the head count went down about 20%, and the intensity also reduced. And we can look at that, but then we can also break that apart into 19 subnational regions and see how the trajectory of poverty looked by each of those regions. And we can look at the initial levels of poverty and the rates of change of each of those subnational regions. That's using a property of subgroup decomposability. But then we can go a step further and we can break the measure down now not by regions, but by the 10 indicators or the 15 indicators or whatever indicators it is made of, in a sense to see how these have changed, which policies have been effective, and to analyze those more carefully. And then we can put this together, and we can look at the changes by the indicators in every subnational region. And this is what makes it quite a useful tool for governance. So these are some of the characteristics of measures that we will learn from different colleagues about how they are designed and how they are used. But the image, which Joanne Tompkinson, I believe, came up with, is that the MPI is like a high-resolution lens, because you can zoom in by subnational region or by indicator and see more details. So that's, in a sense, the features of the methodology. Now, to close, I will spend just a few minutes on the MPPN. Some of you will know this because you've been leading it, and maybe there are some surprises for each of us about what we have done together. And this is the work of the whole network, and so I feel very humble to be able to show all of your accomplishments. The network was launched on the 6th of June last year in Oxford. President Santos from Colombia was a keynote speaker, and Professor Amartya Sen also gave a keynote address in the Sheldonian. At that time, there were 16 countries present, and it was supported from the very beginning by GIZ and BMZ, and they've been very important, indeed vital, supports throughout the whole process, substantively as well as in resources. So here are some pictures. We work on poverty, and poverty is our main priority, but we do also appreciate tonight the boat ride and last year some of the surroundings. Although there were 16 people present, they came from 22, there were 22 countries part of the network. Not everybody was able to participate. And then also from the beginning, there have been other associations like OECD or CEPAL or SADC as very involved members. And that group also has grown this year. Last year, in the communiqué that the MPPN released, there were 3 priorities. One was about a global or, the expansion of national multidimensional poverty indices, and also subnational pilots, as in the Wuling Mountain region of China in those days and the state of Minas Gerais in Brazil. There was also a priority to have an effective and informed voice in the post-2015 discussions. And then we also had a third priority, which was promoting joint research and the development of tools. So policymakers can tell researchers, this is what I want to do, but I can't do. and researchers go away, and they take a while. Researchers are slow people, but eventually we make the policy tools that perhaps could be of more use. So what are some achievements? Here, I think you will have to inform us, but there have been a lot of visits back and forth to many countries. These are the ones we know about. I'm sure Gonzalo has many, many more we don't know about. But there's just a lot of cooperation, phone calls, physical visits, and exchanges going on. I don't know why and what the benefits have been, but perhaps one is simply to learn. How did you do it? How did you do it technically? How did you do it in terms of the institutional? How did you do it in terms of the media and your press releases and the launch? And perhaps it's also a bit of safety in numbers, knowing that other respectable countries, I mean, every country is respectable, what do I say? But the leading countries have really rich experiences that we can learn from. That's certainly given a kind of confidence in advancing this work. And then there's also been the network meetings. We've met quarterly by teleconference and had updates also every quarter. And this has been a rich time because in every teleconference we learn what different members are doing and how they are advancing in their work. And so it, again, is a rich place for interchange. There have also been some key decisions that were made. One was to house the Secretariat at OFI. One was what criteria would be used to accept additional members to the network. And the third was to set up a working group on the post-2015 agenda, and particularly initially on the survey. Another aspect of activity in the network has been technical trainings and advocacy. So there have been a lot of trainings that have been held, which are both for the technical staff and also for policymakers, familiarizing them, in a sense, with multidimensional poverty measurement, what it is and how it can be used. And finally, we had two side events. We had a side event to the UN General Assembly in September last year, and we had a side event in the Islamic Development Bank annual meetings last month. So the side events, in a sense, were another chance to deepen our understanding, to prepare and clarify the messages that the MPPN wanted to put out. Because only a few months after launching, in June, in September, it held a side event with 6 countries speaking. And as I mentioned, the Islamic Development Bank, in a sense, the side event builds on a long-standing commitment from 2011. This quotation is taken from the Islamic Solidarity Fund for Development, which had already recognized and named the importance of multidimensional poverty. And then there have been other groups that have proven, very active, in addition to the national examples we'll hear this morning. For example, ECLAC, or CEPAL, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, in their social panorama of 2013, they addressed poverty from a multidimensional perspective. And this is going to be continued at a regional level in the forthcoming panoramas of the ECLAC, and it will be using the AF methodology that others have used. And they also are exploring not just having an acute MPI like the global MPI, but a different moderate MPI that might reflect more accurately the kinds of deprivations that are priorities in the region. Many other users would report. I know that Mabel was not able to come from SADC at the last minute, but SADC, the Southern African Development, uses MPI as a standard indicator to compare the SADC countries. And MedStat also uses the MPI for similar purposes in the North African region. And the UNDP Latin American and Caribbean Regional Bureau is developing a regional human development report that will present different multidimensional poverty measures from this network. Then the OECD, in the Development Cooperation Report 2013 on ending poverty, did include some chapters on multidimensional poverty and proposed in their executive summary creating a new headline indicator to measure progress towards eradicating all forms of poverty, which could complement the current income poverty indicator. And Hildegard Lignau told us that there's been additional tweeting and progress since that report has been launched, which I'm sure she will tell you about. Then there are many other actors, as we heard in the opening remarks. I'll just give one final example. This is the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and Lisa Brsales from the Philippines and Pali Lalohoa from South Africa. We were together in a meeting of SDSN a few weeks ago, and they have put into their May 22nd proposal this particular formulation for the post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals, having a goal of ending extreme poverty, including hunger, and a target of ending extreme poverty, which includes absolute income poverty, but is not limited to it. Indeed, they propose two goals. One is the goal of $1.25 a day income poverty, and the other is a goal of a modified MPI to complement it. And in particular, they say they would support the creation of a revised MPI that could track extreme deprivation, and they give some examples of the indicators: nutrition, education, healthcare, water, sanitation, access to modern cooking solutions, and electricity that's reliable. They endorse the F methodology, and interestingly, they also endorse the light, powerful survey that the MPPN came up with during the year. I mentioned that there was a working group on post-2015, and in November, that network came forward with a draft survey and circulated for comments within the network. In April, a revised survey was opened for comments internationally. In June, the comments were closed, and that survey instrument, which has now become, in a sense, a set of survey modules, is under revision again. But it is possible way of articulating some of the new indicators that could be added, either to national statistical offices and standard surveys, or to international instruments like the Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey of UNICEF or the Demographic and Health Survey of USAID. So those are, in a sense, some of the achievements, and this is my last slide. 16 members were present in June of last year. We now have 32 countries participating and 10 multilateral bodies, and there are different outcomes and documents that you have in your packages of the network strategy. The survey is online, it's a bit too big, and the communique of how we should take this forward in the coming year. And that is really the work of the next 2 days, to learn from each other, but then really to try to step back and say, on behalf of the poor people, on behalf of those to whom we are most committed, how could we work together and use these 2 days to coalesce some purposes that will enable each of us to drive that work forward more effectively. Thank you very much.